It's called Black Pain, Writing About Trauma. So the authors that we have here discuss the healing aspects of writing about trauma, navigating Black pain and grief, especially in the world of white publishing, and of trauma and about trauma as therapeutic or a form of protest. This will be moderated by Majora Carter. So thank you. And for further ado, authors can come on and have a seat.
Check. Yep. The sounds of the Bronx, New York.
It's a very hip-hop mic check right there.
Grateful.
Holla. So our mic sounds nice. Thank you guys for coming. I'm super excited to be here. So I am joined actually from my, let's just say your left to right. So we've got Nana Kwame Adjei Brenya from Chain Gang All Stars. Those next. We got Sidik Fofana, Stories from the Tenants Downstairs. Next is Tanya Kateri Hernandez, Racial Innocence. And Tyriek White, We Are a Haunting. First, give it up for all of these amazing, amazing writers. So when Sarcia, the founder of the Bronx's Reading, actually invited me to moderate this panel about Black pain, I was kind of confused, to tell you the truth. But then I remembered how many people would tell me after reading my book, Reclaiming Your Community, You Don't Have to Move Out of Your Neighborhood to Live in a Better One, which is about our approach to community development. They would often say to me, I cannot believe what you went through with all the anti-Black woman bias from some local activists, as well as card-carrying members of the white power structures, very public smear campaigns, losing my brother to a drug war, sacrificing my health, all the while trying to love up on my community through our community development work. And then I was like, oh yeah, okay, so I get it. So here I am with all these amazing authors who use both fiction and nonfiction to explore the racist dysfunction of our world that cultivates and supports Black pain. By design, it's meant to be debilitating, but still we rise. Oh yeah, okay. So we've only got 50 minutes, and we want to make sure that we get time for absolutely everybody. But I wanted to start this discussion with a question for each of them about why and what motivated each one of them to tell the story as they chose to tell it. And there are some really different ways that they all did it. And I think this is even a really important part of it. How did it actually impact them? Okay, so you want to start, Kwame? Who wants to go first?
I can start. First off, I'm really grateful to be on this stage with these incredible authors and with y'all. There are not enough literary events in the Bronx. I live in Highbridge, so shout out to the Bronx's Reading for bringing this here. So just shout out to y'all. Yeah. So my second book, Chain Gang All Stars, deals a lot with the carceral state and prisons. And when I think about the way I wrote it, it's some people might say, I guess it's polyvocal. There's many different points of view, many different perspectives. There are those who are being oppressed, maybe as the main voice. There's two Black women who are the primary voices in the novel, but then there's several characters around them. I think that it was important for me to write this book that way because prisons, the carceral state, and the way they sort of have totally incapacitated our ability to be a compassionate society, it affects us in a multitude of ways, some that are obvious and some that aren't so obvious, I think. Upon doing research, I really kind of was able to discover how, the sort of sinister nature of prisons affects us even on the outside, affects us in many different, how we actually benefit from the slave labor of the incarcerated right now in many ways, whether we know that or not. But maybe more importantly, how the carceral state teaches us to be less compassionate than we might be. It disappears individuals as opposed to people, as Angela Davis has famously said many times. And so I wanted to make it impossible to read the book and feel as though, like, oh, this is not my issue. The violence of the carceral state is everyone's issue, and that felt really important. And then thinking about how it affected me, I've been saying that in many ways, I think I wrote the book sort of hoping I was an abolitionist. I think I was saying I was an abolitionist. On paper, I'm an abolitionist. I know the party line. I've lived with poets before. Like, I know, like, what we say. But I want to, like, fully embody that idea actually, or see if I did, because it's scary and it's not the standard. And by working on the book over 7 years, actually, I think it truly grew my compassion, or my capacity to be a compassionate person. I think about harm differently. I think about systems differently. And by steeping myself in the work of other people working in the abolitionist space, I've kind of grown my, actually my hope, if you can believe that. I feel like a more hopeful, more compassionate person. So I'm actually extremely grateful to the project of the book. I think it's made me a better person for that reason.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and very excited for that book, and just the fact that I'm sharing the stage with these esteemed writers, based on what I've seen written about them and their work. It's just truly an honor to be up here. And again, shout out to Bronx's Reading for this fabulous event. And so, I wrote a book called Stories from the Tenants Downstairs. It takes place in a fictional apartment building in Harlem, New York, and each story is told from the perspective of one tenant or one resident in that building. And my initial curiosity with this, this topic was just fascinated by Black vernacular, urban vernacular, how people talk when they're on the subway, or when they feel like when there's no one recording them, what they're saying as a transcript, how people just naturally express themselves. And I think that I trace that fascination to seeing it on the page through The Color Purple and Sapphire by Push, and just growing up in my neighborhood. I grew up in Boston, and then I moved to New York when I was 18. But just the neighborhoods I grew up, and you see these very colorful conversations happening in corner stores or at the basketball court, or at a family gathering, and just the humor and the wit and the brilliance that people just have off the cuff was ever so fascinating to me. And I've seen it in print through these, writers like Alice Walker and Sapphire, but just, not enough. And I kind of wanted to explore that. And so I guess this collection ended up turning into also a story about gentrification and what happens when people are in a building that they've been in all their lives, and then they're faced with the prospect of having to move out. They're being pushed out, and the place that they call home, it just seems different. When I grew up in a part of Boston called Roxbury. I always say our claim to fame is a New Edition. New Edition from my neighborhood.
I feel like New Edition up here with all these mics right now. You feel like,
right, Ronnie, Bobby, Ricky, Mike. But yeah, that's our claim to fame. And in the '90s, my neighborhood had a certain feel to it. It was just a very, community of color. It just felt like so just artistic and just community, and then now it just feels different, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it doesn't feel like the same place, and I just wanted to explore that. In terms of how it's made me feel, and I think before this conversation we kind of had like a little bit of a confessional moment, but for me it's been a very, very weird, strange experience, and probably you as a writer, you kind of like live this certain dream where your work is out there, and you feel like that's the pinnacle and you feel like you should be feeling great, but then a lot of times you don't feel great. And as a writer of color, it's a very, very strange feeling. And I won't go on too long about this because I do want to hear what Tanya and Tyriek have to say about this. But one thing I remember vividly was a very small moment when my agent is shopping out the book. And, you know, if you're a writer and you're lucky enough, agent shops out your book and a couple of publishing houses are interested in it. And from that point, it becomes like an interview type thing, like you're interviewing for a job. And I remember like going from teaching public school in Brooklyn to going to Midtown to a certain publishing office and just going from two different worlds, getting into the building, and then at the desk, you have the security guards who are, you know, people of color, and you feel more comfortable with them, and then you're passing them by to go to the office to sell a story that's about their community, our community, for money to white publishers, and your heart is there with them, and you're going there, and for me, I felt like it was a moment of like mild selling out, but it's just been a weird experience. I'll just stop right there because I want to hear from Tanya and Tyriek.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could listen to everyone else so long, but okay. So I'm Tanya Kateri Hernandez. The book is Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. And the book is a nonfiction book. Well, some parts of it do feel like a horror story. And I will say that I wrote about Black trauma, but I worked my way back into it. And here's what I mean by that. The book was designed to tell the story of how Latinos are systemically part of the problem of anti-Blackness vis-a-vis all people of African descent. Pana! It's always nice to see a friend. And showing up just on time. Okay. So the book is about the systemic story of how Latinos are part of anti-Blackness vis-a-vis Afro-Latinos, African-Americans, West Indians, Africans, right? People from across the African diaspora writ large, right? So in telling that systemic story, how Latinos who are employers don't want to hire Black people, right? Latinos who are homeowners or housing managers don't want to rent or sell to Black people, right? And I use Black in that big tent diaspora sense of it. Right? To tell that systemic story, I'm using the stories of people who I've interviewed and people who I discovered through actual cases. I'm a lawyer. I teach at Fordham. And great pride to be here today. And so it's lots of individual stories. But the way I worked my way back into the Black trauma piece, I mean, it was obviously already in all the stories themselves, right? Of people filing claims of discrimination and just people sort of writing memoirs about it. It's all collected there in the book. I realized that I was going to be talking to a couple of different audiences, right? So, there would just be people like, huh, what? Latinos think beyond, the immigration story, right? Yes, some of us are not even immigrants, right? But in any case, I knew that in talking to different readers, part of the population would be other Latinos, right? And I don't mean anything by not saying the X or the A. That's just my old mouth using the default that I was taught. Anyway, I knew that they might have a form of pushback against the message of the book about us being part of anti-Blackness, and that it would be very sort of a way to dismiss it is to say, well, that's not me. That's what those individual people. That was just that one landlord. That was just that one person, who was a job owner, right? And I knew that in order to kind of bring it back to them, I had to bring it back to the family, right? And I called the family the scene of the crime, right? As far as where we are taught the language and the grammar, right, of anti-blackness, right? You know, many people are familiar with the trauma that happens when a mother is combing tightly coiled black hair, all right? To be a child and to be in the family and to hear a parent or another caregiver who loves you but is busy screaming, "Ay, maldito este pelo," right? I hate this, this horrible devil, ridden hair. That is not only teaching the child, right, that they have inherently bad hair, it's teaching the entire family. So even the light-skinned folks are being taught what the rules are, right? And so that was sort of the genesis of sort of circling my way back to including a chapter called Family Racial Trauma. Right? Now, as far as how it's affected me as an author and the relation to the white publishing world, is that I've started to feel a bit triggered myself as I was writing it. There's just so many times that you can write the N-word, even just typing it. It felt like an assault. And that made me think differently about how it would be read on the page. And so I use a device. Gotta read the book to see. I use a device to not constantly say it, but also not use the euphemism of N-word. Because I just felt like that kind of defangs what the actual harm is of it. So there was that. And then the other way it affected me was once the book was out in the world, was to see the way in which it had such an emotional impact with readers. Right? So when I've done book, gatherings like this, oftentimes folks have already read the book, and they are coming up with their like well-loved dog-eared pages, highlighted and everything. And during the question and answer session, there ain't no question and answer. It is like church. It's testimonials, right? It's folks expressing and relating, and I love that. But as how it affected me as an author is when it kind of took me back for a moment. As like I didn't realize I was doing all that people had a thirst and a hunger to be able to, one, see themselves on the written page, but also be able to see it systemically. Because when it's just you sitting alone with your pain, right, it can be very disempowering. Right? That is to say, if you don't see the ways in which that trauma actually has a structural and systemic tool-making, regulating, social hierarchy producing effect, then it's much harder to push against. Because what are you left with when it's just your story? I feel X. I feel Y. And then what are you met with? Well, that's just you. Right? When the stories are all put together and someone who's part of a community and social activism is trying to provide a framing for how to think about this as a community and a community that wants to have it addressed, because the book does that too, that's a very different kind of dynamic. And so that for me was kind of mind-blowing. And then I'll just close that. The other part of kind of doing this in the white publishing world is that I was having to cross a couple of borders. One, there was, of course, the race border, but there was also the linguistic border. So I'll give you one example. When it came time for the audiobook, I was like, ooh, audiobook. They let me know that they were going to give me some samples of auditions. And I said, oh, okay, cool. Are they all bilingual? And my editor, who had been fantastic, had ushered the book with such love, says to me, why do we need that? I was like, because there's a lot of Spanish in the book. Right? I wasn't going to constantly be doing that translation because I wanted, if you know, right? So I wanted there to actually be, I could translate how, but somebody who knows what how is needs to be able to see it right there on the page. But y'all who don't know, that means somebody who's light-skinned, who their skin color might say, oh, they're white, but they got features that say black. So you cannot be white. We got another word for you. You're not exactly white. You white with black ancestry. Anyway, and so I had to teach them. And that's what I viewed my kind of dynamic in the white publishing world, was to teach them the way in which all of these nuances matter, and to not bring me somebody from Spain to be doing this book, right? Yeah. I needed those words. I needed casarillo to be said just the right way.
Right.
So I'll turn to Tyreek.
Thank you.
I love that.
You said the family is the scene of the crime. That's incredible.
That's a bar.
That's a bar. That's definitely a bar. Yeah, and just even going off that kind of, so my book, We Are a Haunting, explores, it's a family saga, sort of a coming of age, but, selfishly, it takes place in my community. I just really wanted to write a story about my hood. From East New York, a public housing project called Boulevard Houses. And when you're writing about sort of disenfranchised identities and communities, such as this is where I'm from, this is where I live and breathe and eat, but sort of being mindful of who you're writing to, who you're writing for, who's going to see these stories, and that's sort of where my kind of conflict came from. So thinking about, I guess, I wanted to kind of upend typical narratives about the hood. Usually it's drenched in like pain and trauma, in which there are moments of honesty and vulnerability in this story, but I had to seek out new ways to kind of write about this. So at times this is a ghost story. The son, the main character, he loses his mom, and it becomes this conversation across time, across life and death, between this mother and the son. So finding this supernatural, surreal kind of way into the story, sort of illuminated new possibilities for me. And East New York for me is so much for me to want to write about it, because it's so particular. Like you would think of, the urban decay of the hood, of the projects. You think of the fields of factories, the endless kind of streets filled with warehouses. But yet, it's surrounded by an estuary. It's marshland. It used to be swampland. It was landfilled up until the 80s, and they dug it up. But, the kind of environmental sort of specificity of this place, I could not focus on those elements, the heating stations, the weight of the smoke from the chimneys in your lungs. Like that felt to me every bit of as important as growing up, in a food desert, or growing up around state violence, or growing up around state surveillance. The environmental sort of properties, is vital to me. It also kind of reminded me of this idea by Orlando Patterson called social death. And he kind of, it's this sort of in-between, and he says it's this place between community and chaos. And that spoke to me. So I was kind of writing into that. I was kind of writing towards that. I guess that's why you get sort of the questioning of life versus death, especially in a place that, wants us dead, in a sense. So a lot of the times, Kali and his mom are, invoking ancestors, or he's invoking his ancestor, right? There's kind of an act of summoning. And that's how I wrote this book, too, just listening to living archives, my folk, my mom, my dad, my cousins, just soaking up that game to write about this place truthfully and honestly. And then when you do that, for me, yeah, it was that moment where, am I okay sharing some of these stories? Because a lot of it is mine, right? A lot of it is based in my experience. But a lot of these are stories from friends, stories from OGs that we've lost, stories from, just so many kind of stories that don't necessarily belong to me. And that feeling of walking in the building and how do you navigate that? How do you, so a lot of the times in the book, I sort of make the conscious decision of, no, this is all you get, kind of. This is how much I let you in a sense, and making that kind of conscious choice, no matter of kind of like editorial, like, oh, how are you gonna do this? Does this make sense? But like, no, this needs to be here because, you know, again, these are our stories in a sense, but there isn't like a belongingness for me. Like I can't stake claim to those. So, and then selling them to white folk is like.
But in telling those stories and releasing them,
right?
How did that impact you?
I think for me, it was great to feel seen in a sense, to feel, you know, because I think when you're growing up in sort of those environments, you think like it's a kind of singular experience, right? Which it's not. You're sharing it with your community, you're sharing it with your neighbors, and trying to find a way like back into your community, I think was difficult for me. But also like trying to figure out whether like, because if I tell like my ancestor story, is that still my story in a sense, you know? I don't know. How do y'all feel?
I mean, I feel like what you all discussed here, because it was really interesting. It was almost as, and I think you sort of put it out there as well, which is this work was an exploration on your part of almost self-discovery in some way, shape, or form. You know, I mean, Kwame, you were just like, you wanted to test to see like how much of an abolitionist you were and what you could learn from that. Tanya, when you discovered the impact that the book had, like that was like a whole other thing, but it's like, oh, wait, telling of these stories puts that out there. You just make it, you know, telling your ancestor stories through your own as well. You know, and Sidik, I feel like this whole idea you discovered, like walking into that room, or rather walking into those places, you know, past the black security guards and wondering if you're selling out. Like these are all moments of self-discovery. But I am kind of curious in particular about the way that you felt, whether it's through publishing or just telling the stories out there. Why I was curious about the selling out kind of narrative. Did any of you feel as though that was a part of anything else that you've done? And say a little bit more about it.
Here's where I had to take a beat during the process. And some of this is also about how media talks to you about how they want to talk to you. Because in the book, as I describe it, it's like people telling their stories.
Right.
And so in the epilogue, I thought it was only fair that I kind of tell my own story of my family's, relationship to anti-blackness. And it begins with this very personal anecdote about how my mother, as an infant, was almost given away because she was too black, right? The family didn't want her. They wanted her adopted out. And that's all the way in the epilogue, right? But the publishing house and media people, whatever, that's what they wanted to talk about, right? And I had to tell you, I knew that would give me more like, more of a little bit of a moment, but it wasn't quite selling out, but it was in the sense of I didn't want to use my family's personal story to be part of trauma pornography. Right? I mean, they just wanted to see me bleed on the page and my family. They didn't really want to engage the social issues, which I mean, I wanted it to be in context. You don't get to see and talk to me in depth about that painful part of my family history and not talk to me about systems and housing and education and the like. So that was one way I sort of navigated that issue of the selling out.
Okay.
There's the writer Rion, how do you say his name? Almacar Scott? You know Rion? Yeah. Rion says, I remember I was on a panel with him once. He said, writing the stories we write, you can feel like a war profiteer. And I know exactly what he means. My first book, Friday, was a short story collection. A lot of the stories dealt with the trauma that might be associated with racism. And because of the very first story in that book, there was a time where I felt like you couldn't believe it. Like I was calling myself like a Black Death news correspondent. somebody would die in America, somebody from Germany would call me to interview me about it. Like, when Ahmaud Arbery died, I remember having a conversation with a German about it. And it gets very weird. I think the sellout piece or that part of it is challenging because we live in a corporate capitalist model. So it's very hard to do anything real and engage with that model and not have some weirdness about it because the model itself is fucked, for lack of a better word. Yeah. So it's really hard to make art and not feel that in any context. I think in particularly when you're thinking about these pains, these violences that we are experiencing. But that said, we have the tools that are available to us, and we also know like the modes we have to like amplify a vision and a voice, and how necessary it is for those stories to exist, because probably many of us have benefited from those stories existing, and they have helped us greatly. So for me, I sort of rest in understanding and knowing that people not being afraid to bridge that gap have sort of saved me. And it's really an important part of my I think, purpose to continue that space. And so when I moved on to this book over here, you said something that really resonated with me, which is discovering that these are systemic issues. That's so important because so much of our pain, so much of our trauma, we individualize it because the system does it explicitly. The carceral state, to me, one of its main functions is to individualize and criminalize what is systemic, maybe most obviously with like poverty, for example. It creates this space where we don't have to have this communal collective energy around things where things can really happen. And I think in terms of the extrajudicial murder of black people, this movement that exists now we started to realize our trauma was collective. We started having because of these viral videos or whatever, we started understanding your experience is my experience. And now, and they can look at all the things that have happened since. But I think the larger corporate capitalist model makes it very difficult to make art, especially if you're going to live off that art and not feel a tinge of what you are describing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Friday Black was the first book I ever pre-ordered. I discovered pre-order, and this is like a story I was like, wanted to tell you before we got on stage, but I'd like held it because I wanted to say in front of everyone. Experience that I had reading the Friday Black. I was on the train going to, in the Bronx, and I was reading, and I think I was reading the retail story, and just this guy saw me like so amused, right? This young guy, young dude. He was like, he might have been like maybe 22 or something.
Yeah.
And he was like, he's like, what's that? What are you reading? And I was like, it's this short story collection called Friday Black. And then he kind of like took the page like of my book, and he like looked at the cover. He's like, that's his name? Yeah, I was like, nah, Kwame Adjei Brenya. He was like, Kwame, that's my name.
Oh.
I was like, yeah, he wrote this. And then he looked at the back and he saw that you went to SUNY undergrad.
Yeah,
Albany. And he was like, I went there. And yeah,
wow.
True story.
That's
and I was like,
crazy.
yo, when I see this man, I'm gonna tell him that story. But it was such a moment of like, I didn't know this book existed. This book could be out there, and what you're saying about like, even though it's a psychological, train wreck you could go through, like just putting those stories out there, and when they find the right people, it's worth all of it. And it could be, it's very tough. It's very tough. Even as I sit on stage, I think about it, and I think about like, writers like Jonathan, Franzen and Barbara Kinsolver and all the white authors, and I'm like, so great, and I love their work. One thing that they'll never experience is having the majority of their fans be of another race.
Yeah.
And when we go on festivals, right? This is as much color as we're gonna get sometimes, right here in the Bronx. Like, we go out somewhere and you see that a lot of the people who are reading, like, to be honest, a lot of the people who are reading, like, or not even reading, like the people who are like coming to you see on tour a lot, suburban moms. Suburban moms are like, And I'm like, oh, wow.
And bro, systemic too, because I always say it, because publishing doesn't choose to come uptown, bro. You know what I mean? Like they love. I was just thinking about this. I'm my first event in the Schomburg Center for this new book. I've never seen a book event like that because they don't come uptown. They don't come to the Bronx. It's downtown, new like Brooklyn, like which parts of Brooklyn. But yeah, to your point, it's another one of those things that the systemic thing that exists. It's an extension of that weirdness we feel engaging in publishing at all, because they probably don't go past 125, on the train.
And I'm gonna make a shameless plug, but to everybody up in here. So part of our community development strategy, we build places specifically so that authors of color can actually come and do their book events. So Boogie Down Grind Cafe and also Bronxlandia. The last time I saw Mirabelle was when she was at Bronxlandia, an event hall in Hunts Point, and Tarana Burke dropped her second book, the paperback, there. So that's how we roll, and in order to support folks, because people do need to come up above on 125th Street, because we are reading. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, who's buying and reading these daggone books? It is so much of us. So I'm just literally I'd be so honored, and we'll talk later. But it's so true. I can't believe you just said that. But of course
it's so true, because I know I live in Highbridge. For me to get to a book, I've had several book events in New York already, right? I mean, because by force we did the Schomburg Center, but like, I know how long it takes me to get to my own events. Yeah. And this is very rare that it takes me 15 minutes. I know. It's very, very, very rare. I got to ride an hour in the train, or if I feel like I got to take an Uber and waste more money and all this shit. But anyways, it's a thing. I really feel like publishing needs to understand that. Like, it shows themselves in where they have events. It shows themselves in so many things. We have the infrastructure. We're building it more and more. So anyway, sorry.
But even the even the stories they choose to publish, like like
that's so true.
The first thing like people say to me in my neighborhood, like, "Oh, you wrote about this place," like, and they'll buy it. Like there's a readership there, but it's all about like what publishing chooses to publish, honestly. I mean, it's the spaces they choose to occupy, of course, but it's also the stories they choose to put out into the world.
Oh, true. That's so true. You think about like Colson Whitehead. I think like my inside joke is like Colson Whitehead is like the biggest comedian ever. Like because it's like he wrote Underground Railroad, Pulitzer, Nickel Boys, Pulitzer, and it's like, yes, person of color, winning those major awards, which is great. And then you think about, but then you're like, he writes about zombies too. He writes about poker, and those are dope books. Like, those are dope books. And it's like, to what extent, to your point, Tyriek, like, what stories are we choosing to put in the forefront? I call him the biggest comedian because he was just like, all right, I was writing my zombies but all right, you want a slavery novel? All right, I went to Pulitzer.
And he knew it, and he literally called it Underground Railroad. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, and I know he's aware of it. Like Zone 1, you're talking about the zombie book. It's called Zone 1. It's a very good book. Yeah. And he understands like what the landscape is. And again, like, that's that war profiteer thing, because he also told that very important and imaginative telling of that story. It's a great book. Yeah. But it's like literally called Underground Railroad. And whiteness loves to attach to black stories in that kind of way. White publishing, I mean, it's a whole thing. We don't have to make a whole thing about that, but they like to do the flail. You know what I mean? Like, hit me with that cat of nine tails. You know what I'm talking about? Yes. That's how I view it. My first book involves a story where explicitly, sorry, just to get into it real quick, where like the whole conceit is that like white people are getting like killed now. That's like the protest to end protests. And I've had someone come up to me, white person, straight up, like, my favorite parts of this were they were killing the white people. Straight, like, just like that. Just like that. And like, I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I think, or they'll be like, honestly, I think you could have gone even harder on white people. Like, that's a thing. I'm not joking with you, bro. I am being dead ass. And there's a whole, I laugh at it because, like, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. It's a thing. Yeah.
Is it performative, though? Is that part of the
performance
of white readership?
Extremely, yes, completely. It's a performance, but it's even more, maybe even worse. It's like a high from like I'm getting off on. Look at me performing my victimhood. thing.
Yeah.
Oh, not my victim, my like
guilt.
guilt.
Catharsis,
Yeah, my guilt. Yeah.
So what do we do with that? I mean, and specifically because honestly, I just love that exchange in big part because it also, I think, exemplified the fact that despite the performative kind of stuff that you go through when you write the stuff and how people respond to it, like there is joy in all the things that we do in terms of how we express it, how we receive it, and that is the truth. And so I think we've only got, did you say we only got 5 minutes left? I feel like that went even faster than I thought. But can you talk a little bit about the joy that comes in the work that you do? Because I feel like despite the fact that, we can talk about some really hard stuff, but for the most part, we're still rising, right? And we discover ourselves, and you give people an opportunity to discover themselves as well through the work that you do. And can you just go for it? Anybody?
Well, maybe because I'm a teacher, I'm always thinking about how there are moments of teaching. And part of this is also helping teach publishing and also book vendors. So the very first book event I did for this particular book, Racial Innocence, was in D.C., a place called Politics and Prose. Right? And they got a model. They got a way they do things. Right? And I said, well, I'm bringing 5 people with me to be on stage with me. They're like, oh, but it's your book. I said, I know that. I know this. But I want them to be with me having a conversation about the collectivity. So it was Afro-Latino activists. It was people from HBCUs. And we got to talk about why the book felt important from different spaces and also lift up all the production of knowledge that had already been done. I didn't invent this world. There's all these other Latino, Latinx authors and many more who are contributing, and the book is about shining a light on them too. And so that has been a great joy. And I've noticed that Politics and Prose replays that video quite a bit. Right? Even though at first, their moderator was like, didn't know what to do with himself. So, part of it is like helping to shape and remold these spaces so that they can better attend to the way in which we roll differently than they do.
Just quickly, I think just falling back into that, I'm writing because my story has to be told, I think when we publish, we have to think about publishing things and the kind of capitalist implications of that. But getting back into, I wrote this because my story and my ancestor stories, my community stories need to be told. And then going to whether Politics and Prose or, I was in Houston at Kindred Stories and just seeing a lawn full of black folk, not from New York, not from my project, but from similar conditions who feel this, who it's gorgeous. And just, I think returning to that and moments like that really, bring you back to that place.
Yeah, no, it's very important that the story gets told, and it takes a long time, lots of hard work and struggle to get there, but when it does, it feels really good. And it's one of those things where I'll probably stress the the hardship of it, the how much work it is in terms of, it's a roller coaster of emotions. You put yourself out there. Some people are really, really excited about it. The best part is when there's an independent bookseller who really, really takes, really, really spreads the excitement, or there's someone who on a podcast who's read this, those are the greatest moments, and you realize how important and how special people are who really, really get on the bullhorn and really advocate for your book. And through all the stress, people dream of being a bestseller and being able to quit their day job. And I always say, at least at the best for me, it's at the best, it's in between money. Book is, it's never quit your job all the way money. It's in between where you're if I took a year off, I'd probably have to come back, right?
That's a year though.
Yeah, it is a year, and it feel good. It feel good. But then, yeah, through all of that and just seeing it out in the world, and like the whole Erykah Badu, like keep in mind, I'm sensitive about my shit. Like, it's like through all of that, just having written, and the way people take it, and when you do get the right, I hope you ended up with the right audiobook person, because when you do get the right audiobook person, and you hear someone interpret your words, whew, right, it moves you.
I had to do their job and my job too. I found her myself, and she's amazing.
That's how it goes. When you get the right audiobook now, you be like, damn, I'm cold at this shit. Like, for real. Like, in a different kind of way. Two things. One thing about joy. There's like the writing of a book and there's the selling of a book. They're two totally different things.
Yep.
I tell my students all the time, I think the glory that's to be had, the true glory that's to be had in writing is in the doing of it. I truly believe that. That sounds like haha, like sure, but it's true.
Yeah.
The moments right after, like I just put my 1,000 words of the day, I feel more content than I probably do on any award stage. I've had that experience. I've been very lucky in some contexts. I feel like trying to make something from nothing makes me feel more aligned than anything else. Then in terms of the other part, though, there is some great beauty. I just came back a week ago I was complaining even about a gift. I did 19 flights in 20 days. My back is hurting right now. But to connect with people, formerly incarcerated people, activists, former wardens who are activists now, Dr. Nekatapia Jones in Cook County, Chicago, all these people who have connected with this work and remind me that, oh, wait, there's a movement happening. There are people who are reading anything, but also reading and trying to grow themselves. Like, the horror notwithstanding, there's a lot of beauty. Yeah. And so the book and the act of writing and, I guess, publishing has given me a chance to see that firsthand, and that's an incredible joy to me.
Do you have time for one or two questions? Or? Yeah, okay. Any questions from the audience? Any chance? Okay.
Audience?
I'm surprised. Our last panel was like, blah, blah, blah. So anyway,
I got a question.
was there?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The role of black bookstores? The question's about the role of black bookstores.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've just been on the road. I feel like I've just done a tour of the black bookstores in America.
Yeah.
It's so incredible, whether it's Loyalty Books in D.C. or we have Lit Bar right by me up here. Baldwin and Company in New Orleans. There's so many. And to me, booksellers in general are like, to me, they're the ones who like, if anyone like put me on, it was booksellers. I feel like they just hand sold my book to people over and over again. So I always kind of bow to them. And with the black bookstores, to me, like it's like the highest level of that, the most truest of that. So to me, they're like an important lifeblood in this whole thing.
Yeah.
So true. Semicolon in Chicago.
Facts, yeah.
I did an event there, and like I'm a short story writer. Short story writers generally are not bestsellers, but except for this guy, but yeah, I remember like I had modest selling or whatever, and I told it was very modest selling before Semicolon, and it was just such a lit event. They made it like a block party. Yeah, it was great, and just it reminded me a lot of this festival where it's just a community vibe and whatever, and I remember the seller. I was just like, I've sold maybe this much, and she had like 2 books in her hand, and she was like, we sold that in a day. Like it was like, she was really pushing it, but yeah, like the booksellers, the black bookstores, it's just you feel like they're advocating for you, but then there's also like love there. There's love there. But yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
And I'll just simply say that in true black family formation, they know how to stretch a dollar. And so, they're often smaller real estate spaces, right? Because rent is so high. But with the advent of Instagram and whatnot, they are working it. So when I did something for Café con Libros, Afro Latinx own one, in Brooklyn, they put that thing on the gram. They live streamed it. And they're great with the photos. I mean, it was such love and care, but also doing what they could with what they had as far as resources. Yeah.
Any other questions out there? Oh, okay.
Oh, that's a good question.
The question was, at what age you want to start writing material?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested in this answer too.
Thank you for confirming that.
Just so they can hear it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I started. I probably started in like elementary school. They had us like write a short story or something, and I kind of took to it. What really did it for me is two things, right? I started writing raps, so I started writing bars, and that kind of, people don't realize like how narrative hip hop is. How many stories get told in hip hop. So I think that kind of trained my mind. And the second is AOL chat rooms. They used to be, active in some of those chats. And some of them would, you RP, role play, different subjects, Harry Potter, Resident,
really?
different genre stuff. Yeah. And so right. It actually though was a more collaborative way of thinking about narrative and storytelling because you're responsible for one character. It's kind of like that. So I think I'm like 10 on a gateway computer, typing in the mid hours of the night, and so yeah, I think bars and weirdly enough, AOL chat, the Tinder age of 10.
Yeah.
Of course. Thank you.
Any other questions? Did you? I'm sorry. Did you have something else to say? Okay. So then you know what? I got another one for y'all. So what you described in terms of joy and just like feeling this thing, in terms of feeling like your ability to attract and support other folks that are who are looking at your work. What advice do you have for folks on the come up and thinking about writing? Like Tyriek, I was in particular, like for the folks that came up to you and you're writing about our neighborhood. Were any of them future writers?
Yeah, and that's super powerful. And with that, just go with your vision. Just go with what you've been rocking with. Go with the idea that you've had, that you've lived with, that sat with you. And even if you think it's wild, of course you should have a community of people who you trust their opinions, who you trust to challenge you, to push back against you, but also you got to remain, 10 toes down. You got to be solid in what you want to write, your vision. That would be my advice.
I would highly encourage writing groups, right? And it doesn't have to be, a big glorious. I heard people talking about these little festival places they go. No, I mean 2 or 3 people meet across a kitchen table, once a week, once a month, and you share pages or you read aloud to each other. Because this is a way to kind of just check in with whether what you're throwing from your mind onto the page is landing with the reader. Or sometimes you're feeling really down about what you've done or how little you've done. 1,000 words a day. Okay. But someone else can reflect back to you the richness of what they see on that page, or help you and you do that for someone else. I have found some of the greatest sustenance in thinking of writing in that very collaborative way, where we're each writing our own thing, but we're part of a community of helping each other.
Yeah, that community aspect is great. It's you think of an MFA as like you go into a master's classroom and there's a group of writers and they're giving you feedback, but then you could just replicate that with your best friends. And so my advice is don't be afraid of being canceled. There's bad cancellation and there's good cancellation. There's that bad whoa, you knew what you were saying when you said that. And then there's the good point where you know in your heart that something is true, and people are afraid to say it. And then you say it, and all of a sudden people are like, oh, wait, no, that's kind of true. And you should always search for that. And then the last thing I always say, I always give the example of the year 1985 in terms of when you're an aspiring writer, because it could feel like when you haven't published, it could feel like it's just a world away. You're climbing this mountain that you maybe never get to the top. But I always like to think of the year 1985 as a big basketball fan. In the year 1985, the MVP was Larry Bird. A rookie or second year was Michael Jordan, was it, And then 6 years of age was Kobe Bryant. He was 6 years old in 1985. And 6 months old, LeBron James. All in the year 1985. And I always like to think of that year, time goes forward, and it will happen. And, I think of being, another great event of color is the Black Writers Conference and Medgar Evers. I remember being in the audience there, when Colson Whitehead and all these great writers were there and just, doing the work and trying to get there. And, it's just a for us bias where in any given moment, no matter where you go, whether it's to a reading or a concert, there are more artists in the audience than on the stage. And so, time moves forward is what I'll say, yeah.
Real quickly, and maybe boringly, I tell people, really focus and grow craft. Think about your craft, meaning your sentence level appreciation, your ability to make decisions on a word or even syllable level. Whether that's reading Toni Morrison's craft sort of articles or pieces. George Saunders came out with a book of Swimming in the Pond in the Rain. Learn to read very closely. Learn to reverse engineer. If you read something that makes you feel something, return to that sentence or that paragraph or that passage or that page or that chapter and try to think about why that order of words in that moment where it arrived made you arrive at a feeling. So that's learning to do that repetitively will make you do it automatically, and it will give you the ability to recreate what you're feeling yourself. That's number one. Number two is assume that whatever you hope, whatever you dream, whatever you think would be the ideal situation is possible. You said, like you mentioned, my first book was a short story collection. Again, I think generally deprivileging sales stuff in general is important, but I've heard so many things. The sales short story collection can't do this, it can't do that, blah, blah, blah. All these things, people say it, and then it happened. And then so I'm like, so now what? Yeah. So they don't know. They don't know. We already talked about all the things we're publishing. So write what you think you should write. Focus on craft. Think of discipline as a way of showing love to your hopes. Really grow with discipline. I know it's not that fun, but discipline is what makes the wheel hit the road. Because you can have a lot of energy, but that's just spinning wheels. How can you trick yourself if you have to into getting some kind of work? And so basically discipline, craft, and really belief. Those are, to me, those pieces that can make a writing thing happen.
So those are some beautiful words of wisdom to live by, but I think underscoring all of this and the foundation of all the folks that are here is the belief in themselves to tell a story that needs to be told in the very unique way that each one of them has. And obviously, I think there's so many folks. I love the fact that, you go to a conference, a writer's conference, and there's going to be more artists. And everybody, all of us are just that. So the all power, ashe to you, all my brothers and sisters. Kwame, Sidik, Tanya, and Tyriek, thank you so much.
Thank
Honor
you.
to be here. God, what a
Thank you,
blessing.
guys.
Really, bless you all. Thank you all for coming.
It's my imagination.